most part, we're going to be saving these towards the end, particularly for these complex ones. You'll find that a lot of these questions will have answers that are summed up as "it depends," and we're happy to talk about those, but we'll want to leave those towards the end. And as for introductions, as I said in the beginning, my name is Ken, and I have here with me today Alexander and Chris, who Alexander, I think, oh, wow, English is hard today. Alexander, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. Good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Alexander Wells. I am working in the training department here at Dandy. I'm one of our dentists on staff. My training formally was done at Ohio State. So if there are any Buckeye dentists here tonight, you get bonus points for being here. And primarily I work within our clinical support program right now. I'm going to hand it over to Chris to let him introduce himself.
Hi, everybody. Chris Nelson here. I am a technical advisor for Crown and Bridge and complex cases here at Dandy and CDT in Crown and Bridge. So let's kick it off, Ken.
Let's do it. All right, so quick overview of what we're going to be going over here today. I'm going to give you guys a brief history on intraoral scanning, particularly as it relates to complex scanning, where we are, where we're going. Chris Nelson is then going to go over some of what we consider to be our key tips and tricks for getting comfortable with scanning. We're then going to run through, Alexander's going to go through what it looks like to have a good scan, what it looks like to have a bad scan. We're going to finally wrap that out with some techniques that are specific to complex cases. So techniques that may make sense for complex removables, but maybe not necessarily for complex implant cases. And then we'll wrap it out with a live Q&A. All right. Sounds like a plan. My dentist is a Buckeye. Perfect. All right. Before we jump into this, though, I'm curious just to get a temp check from the audience here. Want to know if you guys are using intraoral scanners for restorations today. In the poll, I'm curious, how many of you guys are using it for fixed and removable versus just fixed? These polls used to be, do you use a scanner? Yes, no. And it used to be a lot of people didn't have scanners. As more and more people have gotten scanners, we have evolved into this because it's very curious to see how people are doing dentures and partials with these now. All right. Any guesses here on the breakout? Come on, you gotta have something.
50-50.
50-50 for three choices. I'm just giving you crap. Yeah, I'm actually not sure at all with these. It used to be really easy to predict, but these days, especially with the advent of digital dentures and everything else, it's been such a mix. All right, let's see what we got for results here. Wow, I was actually not expecting. I was expecting a higher percentage of no. Holy cow. So 60% of everyone here, I guess it makes sense. We are talking about complex scanning. 60% of attendees here do use intraoral scanners, and seems to be surprisingly close to 50-50 between fixed restorations and fixed and removable. Great. So for everyone here, hopefully we'll be able to get something useful and interesting out of this. Let's talk history then. I'm sure for many people here, it has been pretty well known that intraoral scanners, while fine, especially as of recent for single unit restorations, when you think about complex restorations like full dentures and all on X cases and just like 6 to 8 unit complex restorations, scanners were difficult to use. And that's putting it nicely. These cases, you find yourself, if you were on the iTero side, remember the foot switch and the enormous scanner with the image limit, like realistically, you were not doing anything more than a single unit on that case. Or even with the blue cams and the 3M scanners, like you're going sitting there spraying powder on individual preps. It was pretty tedious. In addition to that, even less complex cases, but more common intraoral scenarios like, patient's missing a tooth, patient is missing multiple teeth. You would just have edentulous spans. Most scanners have historically struggled to handle those kinds of intraoral environments and scenarios. Like if you didn't have full fixed dentition, it was a struggle to say the least. And as of recently, you're starting to see more and more scanners be able to handle partially edentulous areas, but edentulous arches is still something that all but the best scanners struggle with. And finally, this is something that we have noticed develop across the board as digital dentures and digital removables in general get more popular. You're starting to see more and more people and more scanners, I should say, support the scanning of existing dentures. So using the, for those of you that are unaware, the copy denture scanning technique, where you wash, reline a denture, and then 360 scan that denture. That was something that was actually, frankly, impossible for most intraoral scanners up until maybe 2-3 years ago. But times have changed, and these scanners, especially these certain cohort of modern scanners, are able to pretty reliably handle all of these scanning scenarios that we mentioned here. And to at least go into that, each one of these scanners still requires good foundations and good fundamentals. So I'm going to hand it over to Chris Nelson, who's going to run you through that.
Yeah, as Ken said, we have some tips for scanning here, and we continue to develop these constantly here at Dandy. But if you move to the next slide, please. So setting up the operatory is one that often gets overlooked. You definitely don't want your smallest operatory when you have a scanning card and computer and scanner to put in there. And when you're setting it up, the angle is very important as well. We want to be able to see the patient, but we want to be able to see through the patient to the scan box that's actually providing the live HD images that the scanner is giving out. So if you can see that and see exactly what you're looking at, you know what the scanner is looking at. And the importance of the grip and holding technique is you're moving from upper to lower. You don't want to have to change your position around too much. So conveniently, you can flip the mirror tip on the scanner and you can develop some techniques. We have the twist technique for one, where you can actually kind of wrap the scanner over top of the tooth to get a better image. Next slide, please. Oh, go ahead, Ken.
I was going to add, it does. Sometimes I physically cringe when I've walked into locations before and the laptop is like directly behind the person scanning, and they're like have to turn around every single time to actually see the screen. So yes, totally preaching this.
Yeah, when I'm scanning myself, I look at the computer. I can't look into my own mouth, so that's that's a testament in itself. Sure. So proper isolation obviously is important with crown and bridge preps. The more subgingival we go, the more difficult it is. We love the double cord technique here at Dandy, but there are a number of retraction pastes out there that doctors are recommending. We have braided cord, impregnated cord with hemostatic now. We even have some doctors that use a cord paste combo. So whatever arsenal works for you is okay with me and okay with us here at Dandy. The importance is stop the bleeding, get the site dry, and make sure that we can see that margin. So we want to make sure that we have some separation between the sulcus and the margin line. Next slide, please. So take your time scanning. The important thing to remember is that this isn't an impression. It's not going to set up on you. You have as much time as you need. The important thing is not to move the wand too fast. If the wand picks up too many reflections, too many things it doesn't recognize, then it's going to actually stop taking pictures. So the rest of your movements are futile at that point. It's going to need to come back to a reference point from an earlier part in the scan. It will then understand the images that it's seeing, and we can proceed to fill in the rest of the arch. And full arch scans are very important. It's more information for us at the laboratory. So working in all on X, I like to have as much extension as possible, even though we're not doing a full flange on a denture. We want to have that information so that we have it on file. And not to mention the greater bite accuracy. When we have the contralateral teeth on the other side, we can not only contour the teeth the same, but we can get more information on how they all function together rather than a 5 or 6 tooth quadrant scan where we really don't know what's going on the other side. And another just a great advantage here is we don't have to keep the models and impressions in the office anymore. We can keep a completely digital record for each patient at all times without taking up space in our practice.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. And before I jump into scan reviews, I know there's maybe a couple of you out there thinking is like, okay, these scan tips like seem pretty basic. Like I understand where this gets into complex restorations. And funny enough, part of that is kind of the point. A lot of scanners today are really sophisticated and really smart. And if I'm candid about it, you can get away with some pretty sloppy technique for much simpler cases and still get pretty solid results. But a lot of times where we see clinicians end up struggling is as they try and advance and take what's frankly poor form or poor technique into larger cases and restorations, they start running into challenges and issues, and for good reason get rather frustrated. So for this, foundation is incredibly important. Yeah, I want to reiterate that there. So let's get into that. Those are our foundational tools. I'm actually curious here is going to be a little bit of a pop quiz of what makes a good scan anyway. So I'm going to show you guys a scan here. Oh, and I think we just lost our slide. Is this what we have? Yes. I'm going to show you guys a scan here. And I want you guys in this poll here, you can take a few seconds here to just look at these scans. Want to let me know, do you think this is a good intraoral scan or a bad intraoral scan? Really going to be a pop quiz like it's a middle school again. Because it's interesting, right? There's a lot, you hear a lot of people talk about how intraoral scanners are not viable for all NX. There's too much edentulous span, too much edentulous tissue, sorry. You have tons of potential accuracy problems. Most intraoral scanners actually really struggle, especially with these bloody environments. And a lot of times you may just be better off doing a analog impression. But there are some certain scenarios and certain things that you can look for to determine whether or not these are good scans and these are actually good clinical indications to scan for. So I think we got the poll going on here. Let's take a look at the results. Answer is no. Okay. So I would be very curious to hear, feel free to put this in the chat in the Q&A, your reasoning why, because funny enough, we actually think that this is a pretty quality scan. It is not perfect. And for those of you that called that out and maybe were reacting to that, you are definitely right. However, there's two things that we want to call out, or that I would specifically want to call out for why we believe that this is a good scan, particularly from a lab and design side. So first, focus on the bad. You do have your missing data. You do have a relatively messy border, right? So you do have some voids in the edentulous ridge, and you can also see a little bit of what is effectively excess data here. However, here's where, when we're thinking about all NX, and Chris, please feel free to add color here. When we're thinking about all NX scans, the critical data points and the points where things can go far more wrong is when we're looking at these scan bodies. And it's specifically the scan bodies, the quality of those scan bodies, and the distance between those scan bodies. You'll notice here that between each and every single scan body, we're only talking about a couple millimeters of distance. There are 6 implants being placed here. And so what this means is that when you're using an intraoral scanner, the scanner always has some nice solid frame of reference in their scan. It is always seeing at least 2 scan bodies at any given point. And so as a result, and when we're evaluating the scan, we can say with a reasonable level of confidence that, hey, this is actually going to be a high quality, workable scan. Is it perfect? No. And so this is something that Alexander will speak to later, but this is actually the mental model that, again, we want to reinforce and help with, is like what actually matters and in complex scanning versus what are things that you don't want to go chasing down looking for perfection. So funny enough, I actually did see this intraoral scan happen live. And this surface right here, this void in the edentulous ridge, was just a sutured up area that had tons of blood in it. You weren't, like, the doctor kept trying to go back, scan. It just wasn't happening. And so for us, when we're looking at that, we could see the image count. We could see the distortion starting to build and build and build on that surface. And that's where we told the clinician, hey, you should stop. Don't let perfect be the enemy of the good here. What was important is that you got the critical information here, and you should not be spending time over scanning or potentially introducing distortions into parts of the scan that are frankly less critical to us to design a restoration. Chris, I don't know if I missed anything there.
No, that's a good point. This is a scan body scan, so we're looking for the data on the scan bodies themselves, and particularly the upper portion where the scan features are, whether it's a little knob or a flat surface or what have you, depending on the brand. That's what we're looking for here. The rest is an identical copy of the jaw scan from before, which is actually what we're going to be designing on. And we can use the fill holes function to do the small voids on the ridge there, because this patient's going to be in a PMMA while they're healing. So all of that's going to change for the final restoration as well.
Sure. So I think it'd be appropriate to say it's a good scan. It's not a perfect scan. Again, we don't want to let perfect be the enemy of the good. Okay. Let me hand this over to Alexander here, who can speak to scan quality and reviewing scans in greater detail.
Thanks, Ken. So a big proponent of complex scanning really is a return to the basics of scanning and knowing what to look for in your scans. And like we saw before, what actually is a good scan as opposed to a perfect scan. So to touch base on some of these basics, first and foremost, checking your scan at a very basic level. We're going to want to check every scan from every single point of view. So from the occlusal, the lingual or palatal, the buccal, just to ensure that there are no digital voids in key areas, especially for what we're planning on doing with our patient. And as always, the beauty of digital dentistry is if there is a void, you can just patch that in really quickly without retaking an entire impression. Speaking to point number 2, if your eyes prefer a stone cast, a stone model, as opposed to all of the shades of gingiva and teeth in a patient's mouth, just to simplify what you're looking at, we always have that option just to strip things down to its basics so that you can see things very bare bones. And lastly, what is extremely helpful within digital dentistry, especially with crown and bridge products, is we actually do offer a clearance checking tool. And what's nice is within our software and within digital dentistry, a patient's lower arch, upper arch, and occlusion is all taken into consideration, and we can actually show you across an entire occlusal surface of a crown prep how much you've actually reduced, whether you need to reduce more or whether you're pretty spot on, so that you are, in fact, in addition to, if you use a ball gauge across your patient's teeth, you now actually have a digital representation of how to check that occlusion. Ken, can you go ahead and go to the next slide for us? Thank you. All right, so here we have it. Nice and framed up, our Mona Lisa of scans. And the reason we are considering this the Mona Lisa of scans and hanging it up in the Dandy Art Gallery is really because every surface of the tooth in this patient's mouth is completely scanned in. Every surface, every line angle is here. We're also not seeing any digital voids, which would show up as just white patches or green patches. And you can even see in terms of level of detail, this patient has a lingual fixed retainer across those anteriors, and even the detail there is completely scanned in. So ideally, if we're using this as our visual representation of what our scan should always be looking like, everything here is scanned in completely, no digital voids. Ken, can you go to the next slide for us? So, given that Mona Lisa of scans, we did want to look at some pretty common scenarios with very basic scans that actually will impact long-term complex scanning. So here we would call this trope of bad scan the overscan or the overscanner. So starting with that image in the top left-hand side of this patient's upper arch, this is pretty close to what that Mona Lisa looked like. We have every tooth surface scanned in. I'm not seeing any white patches, green patches, digital voids. So at face value, this looks ideal. However, a very common thing that we see clinically is if we shift our eyes to the image on the right-hand side, we often see practitioners bringing that scanner back in and rescanning and overscanning quadrants or teeth that are already fully captured. And often, you might think that might make a more accurate image, but actually that works against you. Overscanning areas can actually lead to more distortion. So ideally, as your scanner is collecting images and building your digital models, we aim for about 2,500 images as our ideal or standard. So that Mona Lisa scan, that was a scan I performed, that's actually just about 2,100 images. So it's very doable, very easy, especially if you're comfortable with a patient that has all of their teeth still. But again, the overscan, especially when it becomes more tempting with a more complex case, is something we ultimately want to avoid to prevent distortion. All right, Ken, can you go to the next slide for us? All right, Now to hone in a little bit more specifically to basics with crown and bridge work. Two big things that I want to note here. The first is this, I'm referring specifically to this image on the left and margin visibility. So with a digital scanner, with 3D scanning, the scanner is only going to be able to build an image off of what it sees. So if a scanner is seeing a lot of blood and tissue covering the margins of a crown prep, that's actually what it's going to embed into its image. If you take that rule of thumb and translate it into sending this image to a lab, if you can't see that margin while you're sitting chairside with your patient, the lab's not going to be able to see that margin on our end either. So what is recommended on a case on the left-hand side, because we do need that margin visibility for a perfectly fitted crown, would honestly be clean up the blood, see if we can retract a little bit, and go ahead and rescan to see if we can get a better image of that margin. On the image on the right-hand side, this is sort of the big point with crown and bridge as well. Not only would your actual crown prep tooth be important for this final impression scan, but so is that adjacent tooth that we're building the contact off of. On that image on the right-hand side, the area within that red circle that is just that white patch, that would be the equivalent of a void in a PVS impression or a digital void. So here again, the lab would be given a lot of guessing work in terms of creating a properly contoured crown. This would probably affect the actual contact point between the ultimate crown and this adjacent tooth. What's nice about digital dentistry, again, is you can just bring that scanner back in, do some patchwork, clean it up. Another important note here, that image on the left, that's our occlusal view. The image on the right, if we were to look at it from the occlusal view, we might not see that there are those pretty big voids on that mesial surface area. So again, the ability to rotate these in 3D space, checking all surfaces from all angles, extremely important in our basic cases, even more important with our complex cases. All right, so from here, I'm going to hand it back over to Ken, and we are going to dive into some actual examples of complex cases and what scanning looks like for those.
Thank you, Alexander. All righty. Yeah, let's just jump right into this. I'm going to go ahead and start here. Something that I am particularly, I would say, passionate about is scanning for fixed implant restorations. And one of the most common things I see, particularly with certain scanning workflows that encourage you to use emergence profile scans or effectively multi-stage scans, is I'll see a clinician that will go through, they'll scan a quadrant or they'll scan a full arch, and they will then go ahead, trim out, do the right thing, scan the healing abutment, trim it out, scan the emergence profile. Everything's going great. Everything's going smooth. They then go in, screw the scan body, and then you can see right here in a trio scan, and this is true for most intraoral scanners, you can see that the area around the emergence profile has been trimmed out. I cannot tell you the number of times I've seen a clinician start the scan over the trimmed out area. Remember, these scanners need landmarks and they need to see something that they have seen before. You need to start the scanner on a neighboring surface, a neighboring occlusal surface, and then slowly but surely bring that scanner over onto the scan body instead. If you start on the scan body, it's just going to is actually not going to pick anything up because it's never seen a scan body before. You just entered into the scan in the first place, which does lead nicely into my second point: capturing as much of that scan body as possible. Again, I'm actually just going to jump right back here because these scan bodies here were so clean. You need to go ahead and capture all of the detail on that scan body. This is our transfer coping. This is how we as a lab will go ahead and digitally design either a custom abutment or a tie base. If we don't get good data here, we have a poor foundation. We're not going to go ahead and be able to fabricate a phenomenal final restoration. So make sure you capture, again, like Chris Nelson was saying, the most critical component is the top third. But if you can go ahead and capture the remainder of that scan body and capturing in high fidelity, that is super critical for us. And frankly, one of the foundational components of making high quality final implant restorations digitally. And last but not least, the emergence profile is critical, particularly for digital. So if you think about this, the holy grail of impressioning for implant restorations would be to have a perfect understanding of the emergence profile of exactly how the patient is healed, and then an impression for the implant position, so transfer coping, scan body, what have you, analog or digital. You would be able to combine those two to be able to perfectly contour your abutment or perfectly contour your crown, and get that bang on perfect emergence profile that you're looking for with that final restoration. With analog impressioning, that process can be a bit more tedious to impression for both the anatomy of the tissue and for doing a pickup. But with digital, you have a much easier time doing this. Scan the quadrant or scan the arch, unscrew the healing abutment, trim out the healing abutment, scan that emergence profile, screw in your scan body, and all you have to do is scan the scan body. I've seen this happen live. This process takes anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes max, and this gives you the gold standard of a digital implant impression. When you have all those pieces, we can go ahead and custom make what is my preferred method, which is be a custom titanium abutment that is contoured perfectly with a nice strong zirconia crown on top. Those are my tips and tricks for at least for implant restoration scanning. I'm going to hand it over to Alexander to talk about subgingival scanning.
All right, thank you. So I would say that the most recurring question that we get over and over again when we're having conversations around crown and bridge and scanning is a scanner capable of picking up a subgingival margin? And our answer is always yes, and it really speaks to this first bullet point. It's yes if you have proper retraction. So with a PVS impression, that impression material, especially if it still hasn't set, does have the ability to reach down and pick up a very deep or subgingival margin. The bigger difference here with a 3D scanner is that the scanner relies on visualization or having a direct clean line of sight down to that margin. So here in navigating a very subgingival case, what we really need to make sure is that gingiva is pushed as far away from that margin as possible, and that scanner is given every opportunity to be as close visually to that margin to be able to pick it up and create an image. As is the case when using PVS impressions or anything else, tissue removal, gingivectomy might also just be required given the nature of the case and the depth of the decay that was required for us to take away. So those same basic principles do apply. But again, the key for subgingival scanning is really quite simple. It is just excellent retraction.
If you're going to walk away from anything in this in this presentation, it's retraction.
Very important.
Exactly. All right. And then finally, Chris Nelson, let's give you the floor here and talk about all on X.
Okay, so all on 4, all on 6, all on X, so whatever kind of case you're doing. For me, to simplify it, the thing that we're looking for is a complete denture scan with all of the data and extension that we can possibly get with a good bite scan with the VDO and proper occlusion. And we're also looking for that perfect scan body scan, or as close to perfect as we can get. So it's really just combining a denture workflow with an implant workflow and putting the two together. The role of the bite scan is incredibly important. The upper will never move, but we need to make sure that we have the mandible in the correct position. Otherwise, we can't properly do the occlusion. We can't line up the midline, and there can be numerous other problems with that as well, including screw channel placement. On the right side, upper right, we have a classic converted denture here. You can see where all the material was ground away, especially on the lower, and temp posts were put in to convert this denture into a screw retained. So you can see on the lower jaw, there are a lot of tissue landmarks that we have exposed there. The upper jaw is a different story. We not only don't have the full palate, but we have no buccal tissue to align the jaw scans to. So the important thing to remember is whatever's on the jaw scan has to be in the bite scan so that we can line up those marks. We're going to literally pick 1 to 5 points depending on how many are necessary to line up the jaw. So you can never have too many reference points, but 3 is enough especially if it's a perfect tripod around the jaw, for us to go ahead and align that. And patient photos become extremely critical in this situation too. The bottom right photo shows, it's a little tilted, which, just makes you cock your head to look at what's straight. So I'd rather have that straight on, but at least it gives us the information on how much tooth the patient is showing, upper and lower, where the midline is, and what the overall length comparison between the teeth are. And we love to have a facial shot as well as a profile, smiling and at rest, just so we have all of the information on how much overjet we might have and anything else that we can get out of that photography.
Awesome. All right. So before we get into live Q&A here, we're just going to run through a little bit. Want to tell you guys about Dandy and what we're doing here digitally. I'm already seeing a couple of good questions here around. There seems to be a pattern with video and appliances, so we'll be going through and answering those questions shortly. And get your questions in. I just want to run through real quick and explain to you guys Dandy and how we believe we can actually make a lot of this complex scanning and restoration process easier. So a little bit about us. I like to describe ourselves as a dental lab reimagined from the ground up with technology. What we mean by that is, frankly, what we ended up doing, which is if you were to start a lab from day one to day, what would you do different given I won't say unlimited resources, but given the opportunity to do things from scratch and do them well. And so in our mind, it was being a full service dental lab that was completely digital, doing every appliance under the sun, including our removables from intraoral scans. And given that the promise of digital is supposed to be fast turnaround times and high quality production, we believe very strongly in US-based production. I'm happy to say that all Dandy appliances are made in the United States. And so when I say full service lab, I mean full service lab. Fixed restorations, veneers, implant restorations, implant surgical guides, dentures, full dentures and partial, clear aligners, splints, night guards, soon to be TMJ appliances as well. You name it, we do it. You shouldn't have to compromise and still go back and forth between an intraoral scan and an analog impression when you're going through your digital transformation. What makes us a little bit different, though, is that we candid about it. We have a lot of our own tech. One of the key components that we built in the applications that we have is something called Dandy Chairside, actually. We noticed that there were a lot of deficiencies, frankly, of intraoral scanners, things that were built with certain limitations of scanners in mind. And so we decided to go from the ground up and build our own scanning software. And from our perspective, it is a lot more of a guided experience. So rather than going through and trying to figure out sequencing and holding sequencing in your head like you normally would have to for a lot of these complex cases, we do all of the guided scanning for you. So if you go to us and you indicate that you are doing a full denture or you're doing a complex 6, 8, 10, 12 unit restoration, we will appropriately adjust what scanning sequences and what scanning order you should be going through, in addition to going actually above and beyond that, where we can say like, hey, this step right here, put the scanner down, take a photo for us instead. We're going to need photos on this step. And obviously I'm very biased. I work here, but as someone who is using scanners a lot, a lot before Dandy Chairside, I do believe it is a materially smoother and better scanning experience. This also comes in with the support component as well. So when you're here, our average response time is 120 seconds. If you have a patient in the chair and you're looking at a scan and you're not 100% sure if it's a good scan or a bad scan, at least in the Dandy infrastructure, you are able to message us. And again, within 120 seconds, someone will not only be responding to you, but can actually remote into your computer and look at that scan for you. Very often, funny enough, it is Chris Nelson or one of his other colleagues that's actually looking at your scan and letting you know whether or not, hey, do I need to rescan this? Is there a patch of scan data that you're missing? Or could be, you're actually good to go. You're good to go, doctor. Just go right ahead. That all bundles into a really nice experience that we find makes digital and complex scanning much easier. And then on the back end as a lab, we have a lot of quality of life features and products that we have, namely a mobile app where you can go through, track your orders like you're supposed to be able to in Amazon or any other modern ordering experience. You can see digital wax-ups and digital designs for free. Chat with an expert directly and be able to provide feedback on an order by order case. finally, the cherry on top, I think what you have seen a lot of questions come about Dandy or seeing us online is, yes, we do give you an intraoral scanner for free. So for your clinicians here that don't have a scanner, we believe it would be a phenomenal option for you to go digital. And if you guys are already digital, but are looking to add another scanner to your practice, or maybe be able to support more advanced scanning workflows and certain appliances, Dandy is, I think, the perfect option for you. We give you the cart, we give you the laptop, we also give you the training, which is ongoing and free. That is what Alexander does day in and day out, and he's really, really good at it. And we believe ourselves to be probably the best solution out there to go digital with and actually perform restorative dentistry with. All right. That's my spiel. That's Dandy. That's complex scanning. Let's get into these questions. I've seen some phenomenal ones come in here. We have a question here from Paige Barden. Chris, this may be one for you. How would you recommend scanning and taking a bite with a full mouth restoration is taking place at one time without losing the VD out?
Yeah, great question. So the nice thing about the digital workflow, especially for crown and bridge cases, is we can go ahead and scan the upper, lower, and the bite scan pre-op. And then we can go back and trim out the teeth that are going to be prepared. And we can trim those out one at a time, two at a time, three at a time, and rescan the preparations in there. So depending on how many units you're doing, that's a great workflow for crown and bridge. If the patient's edentulous, we can use any number of methods, including wax, bite rim, a bite splint, an existing provisional, existing denture, whatever we need to accomplish the scan of the VDO in position, as long as we have those tissue landmarks. If you remember the converted denture slide that we showed, we just need to have those on the jaw scan and the bite scan, and we will always be able to match the two together.
Cool.
And I think that actually flows into the next question from Amy here, scanning for dentures. And so we still use wax rims, but we just scan them. So it's a little bit different in that regard. But with wax rims, we can get the VDO accomplished there. You can put in blue mousse if you want. You can use wax to fill any voids in the wax rims that may have it uneven. And once we have that scanned in there, and for dentures specifically, we can do a 360-degree scan where we actually capture the tissue and the occlusal at the same time, which makes the workflow a little bit easier if you're matching the bite together.
Yeah, Amy, one thing that is a little counterintuitive about digital dentures, or at least how Dandy does digital dentures, is that if you are starting completely from scratch, like your patient doesn't have any kind of pre-existing appliance, even an immediate, usually you actually don't need a rim unless the bites completely collapse. But in that scenario where you're just starting from zero, the purpose of the wax rims for us is functionally the same as what any other lab would do. However, what we're not doing is taking those rims and then setting teeth into that instead, at least not in the analog sense. Instead, whatever modifications you make to the occlusion and when you're marking midline and the canines, we are actually taking your scans of those wax rims, usually pretty easy to do, it takes like 5 minutes with the scanner extraorally. We are taking those and importing those and using that as a reference to do digitally designed dentures instead. That's why we still use rims. I think they work. they're perfectly functional. Most people are familiar with them, but we don't need them shipped back. And as a result, you don't really have to deal with a lot of the tedium that comes with doing dentures. It's not going to be a 6-appointment affair. We're using rims just as an effective tool, as a stopgap tool. Cool. One thing that I just saw here, Alexander, I think this actually be a phenomenal question that you could probably answer. David says, I have several cases where I've been unable to fully capture the proximal contact of the adjacent tooth in single unit scans. Straightforward cases, no blood, abnormal contours, etc. I go back multiple times. It looks normal and correct at first, but then it resets with a void. I turn the scanner in multiple directions, tilting, rotating, etc. with no luck. Not sure how to correct that. Do you have any suggestions?
It's a great question, David. And I see this pretty regularly when I'm working with practices. Very foundationally, I would always confirm that my calibration is up to speed. Because if that's not calibrated fully, sometimes it can lead to some fuzzy images in your scans. My second suggestion is this. If you are seeing a void on an adjacent tooth, especially in those tight interproximal areas, my recommendation is to just take that little trim tool, clear it out, and start that scan from scratch, having removed that image, instead of trying to build and recorrect and correct over the currently existing tooth. That ties into one of my slides earlier in the presentation around overscanning. Often, if you're bringing a scanner into the same area over and over again, it actually can cause a lot of that distortion. So again, make sure that calibration is set. And my recommendation is, instead of scanning and rescanning, trying to fill up a small void that might be appearing or shifting areas, take that trim tool, clear it out, and try and do that whole contact area from scratch.
Yeah, one piece I'll add there. That's actually, I didn't even think about that. That is a phenomenal point. This is, David, this is also pretty scanner dependent. What you're talking about can often be like getting into like the really nitty gritty of like the software engine and how the scanner thinks and processes whatever it's seeing in its camera. And sometimes it's looking at a surface and the software is incorrectly categorizing it as like noisy data and then immediately trimming it out. Different scanners behave differently there. But to Alexander's point, sometimes it has preconceived notions of what the contact should look like. And it's just the weird idiosyncrasies of the scanners. And so by removing that chunk and saying, no, whatever you thought was here before, ignore it, start from scratch. Give me another attempt at it. Yeah, it works more often than I'd care to admit. It's a kind of unfortunate, actually, but this is the truth. Yeah. And David actually does have a follow-up to that, which is, can you scan the retraction cord in place to visualize the margin, or does it need to be removed?
Sure, I can take this one. So David, the answer is it depends. So big thing with digital, with scanning, especially with the final impression, is if any part of that margin is obstructed, whether that's gum tissue, whether that's blood, whether that's a leftover bleb of retraction paste, or if it's a sliver of that cord, if that is covering your margin, that means that the lab itself is not going to be able to see that piece of the margin. So we don't have the ability to digitally remove that margin and somehow figure out, the depth of that actual margin. So my rule of thumb is this: if you can have that cord packed completely subgingival to that margin so that no piece of it is obstructing the scanner's view, you can leave it in. If there is even a tiny sliver, I mean even a millimeter, half a millimeter, that is poking out over, I just recommend pulling it and then scanning, just to make sure that the scanner has the best chance at seeing that entire margin in its full capacity.
Yeah. Yep. Would tend to agree. Awesome. All right. One thing I just saw here that I wanted to answer from Aline. Hi, I'm Dr. Aline from Mexico. I would like to know if you print the models to fit the restoration. And this is actually a great question. So for milled monolithic restoration, so for the most part, we predominantly see monolithic zirconia, monolithic or digitally milled Emax. The milling machines that mill those crowns out are generally more accurate and have tighter tolerances than most 3D printers in the world. Like, you have to get to the $50,000 a year carbon 3D printer level to have something that rivals the accuracy of even your average dental milling machine. And so it's funny, one of the things that we learned at Dandy, building the lab out over time, was that adjusting contacts to fit models for monolithic restorations actually resulted in materially higher contact related issues, either contacts too tight or contacts too open, because fundamentally these printed models are just less accurate than the milled crowns, and they can actually just be very deceptive. Now, that's not to say, especially with these models, they're still pretty accurate. And so if you have to do a PFM or like a PFZ off of a digital impression, the printers are fine. But if you're, especially at the scale that we operate in, the volume that we see, we have actually found that modelless zirconia is more accurate and more reliable than zirconia that is finished on a model. Great question. Let's see. We have Let me just go through and pick a couple here. Constantine, do you have your own lab or do you work with many different labs? The answer to that question is a bit of both. So, as I'm sure many people here have heard or have maybe seen online, questions at least about Dandy production, how everything works. The way we work is pretty simple. We have our own in-house technicians and designers. We have this point probably 200-300 technicians. We're a pretty big design team. We design everything in-house for restorations. And then for actual production, we have partner labs in the United States where we design and then we actually give them an RX and we will tell them to manufacture to spec. These partner labs are places actually that has honestly pretty often Dandy employees that work here. They work with other technicians on site to meet our quality standards and our quality control, because to be very candid about it, there is definitely a lack of technician talent in the United States right now. And so for us, it was really important to make sure that our crowns are being made at a very high quality. And frankly, all the good technicians are spread across the country at various different labs. And so in order to make high quality crowns, high quality dentures, partials, we had to go through and partner with a bunch of different labs across the US. We also do have some of our own in-house. Again, it is a hybrid. It really depends on the kind of case that we're working on and what kind of turnaround times you're expecting from that. And frankly, how close they are to you as well. So great question. We design everything in-house. We manufacture everything in the US, either with partner labs or in-house as well. Cool.
I can take the follow-up to that from Constantine, the protocol on surgical guides. We do actually offer surgical planning and guide production here at Dandy. We do have implant CDTs on hand to take your CBCT and your jaw scans and go ahead and do the design for you. And then we set up an appointment, as is the norm, to review that design before we produce the surgical guide.
Yeah, great answer. Eric Werner here asks, what are some tips and tricks you guys have for getting a good, all caps, bite? Alexander, do you want to start that?
Yeah. So it really comes down to just remembering the basics of a good bite registration, regardless of whether you're using jet bite or actual digital dentistry. So there's no change to the basic principle. It's just a change to the material. What I see with patients when a scanner is going into their mouth is that regardless of if the assistant, the dentist, has locked them into the bite they're trying to capture, patients often shift their lower jaw to accommodate the size of the scanner, even if it is ever so slightly. And to kind of bring us back into basics, if we were doing a bite registration using actual material, if you saw your patient shift their bite in any direction, you would retake that impression. Same rule of thumb for using a scanner. And in this case, you might have to have your eyes a little more focused on what that patient's doing with their jaw. Because ideally, if that patient shifts in any way, the scanner is only going to capture what it sees. So the scanner itself isn't going to know that the patient has shifted their bite and is maybe presenting with some form of a cross bite. That's just literally what it's seeing. So keep it nice and simple. And I would recommend just keeping your eyes on your actual patient while performing that scan instead of at the monitor, just to ensure that that jaw isn't shifting in any direction.
Yeah, there are also one thing to add there is there are also some interesting features on the horizons. Is 1 or 2 scanners I know of that do this. It's not the most sophisticated process yet, but there are some scanners that support the idea of actually recording movements. So you start the scanner effectively next to the patient's arches, and you tell them to move side to side, front to back. I've seen it used occasionally to great effect, and so it's better than a bite is a patient actually moving around, biting up and down. But thinking more about the future and the exciting stuff that digital still has to go. Kick us off.
Yeah, I'm thinking we could probably do an entire webinar just on occlusion scanning here. We've got another one here from Paige Barden. When I do an occlusal guard, I like to take a bite registration with the patient in an open position. We have a lot of doctors that do this. They have bitten on a cotton roll for 5 minutes to see the condyles. What is the best way to scan? You're simply going to scan with those cotton rolls in. They will not appear in the jaw scans when we go to design. That's only going to be in the bite scan. I have doctors that use Q-tips, wax, bite splints that they make in their 3D printer, bite splints that they make on a set of models, whatever you need to capture that position. Again, it's all going to come back to the landmarks we have on the buccal tissue and teeth to match up those scans.
Totally. Shannon, I see you posted a message here about explaining the process of going from scan to making a prosthesis. I want to circle back to that. I just want a yes or a no. I get happy to explain it to you. Is it okay if I just describe to you the process of a zirconia monolithic, or is there a particular restorative type that you'd like me to walk through? While we circle back to that, I think we have two questions here. One from Joy Fremont. I'm having a very difficult time capturing the edentulous area for my partials. What are the best tips? I haven't captured a good one yet. And then I also have one from Tamaria McLean, which is basically the same thing. Do you have any tips on scanning a patient with multiple missing teeth as well as a low ridge? Alexander, do you want to take that?
Absolutely. So, edentulous areas, especially when a patient is presenting for a partial, that can be a bit tricky. My biggest tips and tricks are these. First and foremost, you're going to want to make sure that edentulous tissue is very, very dry. And when you're dealing with edentulous spaces, retraction becomes that much more important because the scanner's eye has a little bit more trouble differentiating between an edentulous ridge and surrounding soft tissue of, say, cheek, floor of the mouth, tongue. So making sure that retraction is pristine, great. Make sure the area is dry. This is my last note. When you are moving from the occlusal surface of a tooth to an adjacent edentulous space, you're going to want to move the scanner closer to the tissue. So you don't want to continue your scan at the height of the occlusal table because the scanner is distance sensitive. You're actually going to want to drop that scanner closer to that tissue. And as soon as you are scanning on that tissue, you are going to want to slow down. This type of scanning technique, I cannot emphasize enough that slow and steady wins the race. If you move too fast, as much time as you think that will save you chairside, it's actually going to work against you. Speed and edentulous spaces, whether that's for a complete denture or for an edentulous space for a partial denture, it's just speed. Speed's your biggest enemy. So my recommendation is you might feel a bit silly with how slow you need to scan, but truthfully, just trust that you need to move slowly and you need to make sure that scanner is lower than the height of the occlusal table of the adjacent teeth.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to add there, particularly for partials, this is a technique actually I've seen a couple of clinicians use and I've now replicated myself. Let's say you have an area where maybe you're missing one or two teeth, where it's just far enough that the scanner actually cannot see. Effectively, it can't stitch, right? Because the teeth are so far from the ridge, or like the healed ridge. But the scanner will go through, it'll scan the tooth, and then as you cross over that gap, the scanner loses itself just before you maybe get to that terminating molar instead. One of the techniques that I've seen clinicians use is to actually roll either buccal or lingual and actually scan that ridge instead. Follow the ridge very slowly but surely, right up until you actually start seeing dentition again, and then rolling back to the occlusal table. From what we were talking about earlier with tips, the scanner needs to see landmarks. The best kinds of landmarks are teeth. The second best landmarks, especially for partials, is non-mobile tissue. And so just going through, scanning that ridge right up until you see teeth again is probably a much more consistent way that you could capture those. Last but not least, and I hate to say this, it also really depends on the scanner. Edentulous scanning and edentulous scanning capabilities is a very recent development. And if we're being honest about it, there's probably only 4, maybe 5 scanners on the market that can do it reliably. The latest and greatest Cyteros, so the Element 2s really struggle with this, but the 5s and the laters are okay at it. The Trioses, the Dentsply Sironia's Prime Scan, nothing else, and Medit's latest scanner are probably the only scanners that can do that somewhat consistently. If you have scanners other than that, you're going to be in for a much, much harder time. So let me circle back to you, Shannon, now, because I know you asked this earlier. I said I'd give you an answer. So I'll talk about the zirconia monolithic crown. When it comes to the scanning process, I think this is what we were talking about here earlier. You're effectively using a scanner like this Trios right here, and that is taking a 3D scan of the patient's dentition. That scan is then passed on to a lab that is actually using digital design software. So popular brands are 3Shape, popular brands are ExoCAD. They are purpose-built from the ground up to digitally design zirconia monolithic crowns, and that's actually not true. Purpose-built to design any kind of digital restoration. Zirconia monolithic just happens to be probably the most popular on the planet. Those crowns, so your digitally designed crowns, are then milled out of zirconia, usually within the dental lab on a milling machine. Those crowns come out of the mill. They are singulated off of a disc. They are fired in an oven to actually change it from a powdered state to a nice solid crystalline state. Those crowns are then stained and glazed by lab technicians and then adjusted appropriately. They're then QC'd by usually someone within the lab, shipped and packed and delivered back to you. That is the basic gist of how monolithic crowns are made. And that step right there of replacing hand waxing and then hand adjustment with CAD, that is consistent across digital. So when we hear about CAD CAM, those are the processes and steps that they're referring to. Cool. Let's see, what else do we have here? Now we are coming up close to the end of time, but I think we have time for a couple more questions here. Let's see. Eric Werner asks, when you're taking a CR bite that is held open with cotton rolls jigs, how do you relate that information to the lab so that they maintain that